Hi, it's Mr. Kelly again, and today we are going to have a little conversation, even though it's going to be mostly me talking, about the conflict between Federalists and Anti-Federalists in the context of ratifying the Constitution and what it meant to these two different groups of people in the 18th century. So first, in order to understand what it is to be a Federalist with an uppercase F, as we have here on the right-hand side, we need to understand an even more basic concept, which is federalism with a lowercase f. So federalism with a lowercase f is pretty simple. It's the sharing of power between states like California, Nevada, Oregon, or Maryland, and the national government, which is represented today by Washington, D.C. So an example would be one of the characteristics of the US government today is the concept of federalism, the sharing of power between states and the national government. So to think about this, a Venn diagram is usually pretty useful. So under the Constitution, there are specific powers which are given to the national government, like, say, coining money. You don't see 50 different types of currency in the United States. You just see one, the dollar. That's a specific power that is delegated to the national government by our Constitution. Then you have powers that are reserved just to the state governments. So an example of that would be schools and education, that states really make the decisions on what should be taught in classrooms, when it should be taught, and how it should be taught. But then there are powers that both the federal and state governments have. And there are lots of different concurrent powers that the two have. Like, say, law enforcement, for example, would be one, because there are state and local laws, and there are federal laws as well. So state and local laws would include laws that would, say, make it illegal to smoke in a public space. Federal laws would make it illegal to, possess or use marijuana, for example. That's a federal law. So those are powers that both state and federal governments have, and these are all examples of federalism with a lowercase f. So, like I mentioned before, under federalism, there are specific powers that the federal government has under our Constitution, and these powers are very specific to our federal government, or national government. That includes declaring war on other countries, managing wars in our military, foreign policy, what treaties we decide to make with other countries, and trade with other countries. These are things that are decided by our federal government. And like I mentioned before, currency or dollars. State powers include public safety, like police and fire. Also, the way that we run our elections, all the way from local elections all the way up to electing our state assembly and state senate, and the way that we also run the way that we choose presidential candidates in primaries and like that. Those are all decided by the states. And of course, we also set our own local governments. So when you think about mayors and members of town boards and school boards and the like, the state gets to decide that, or local communities get to decide that as well. So you've got very separate sets of powers for the state, separate sets of powers for the federal government. This is, again, all under the idea of federalism, the sharing of federal and state powers. Now, the federal and state levels also share powers as well. And I mentioned a few before. Here are a couple more really, really clear ones. So states can raise taxes if they wish by, say, putting a sales tax on every consumer item that anybody buys. The states also build roads. They build and maintain state roads. The federal government certainly can raise taxes by levying an income tax on individuals. They also build roads as well. So if you think of the federal highway system, that's federal money, and that's also a federal agency that coordinates the building of interstate highways and the like. So again, with federalism, you've got specific federal powers, specific state powers, and shared powers. Again, thinking about this Venn diagram, powers delegated to the national government, powers for the state governments, and shared powers. So enough with federalism with a lowercase f, and on to Federalist with an uppercase f. A Federalist, it's actually an adjective that describes the people who believed in having a strong central government in the early years of the United States. And specifically, these would be the years after the American Revolution ends in 1783, all the way up until the early part of the 19th century, because not only was it like a belief system, eventually it was also a political party as well. As I mentioned here, it was also the first American political party and the adjective for its supporters. So you could be a member of the Federalist Party in the 1790s and up until the early 1800s, and you could be a Federalist in terms of your philosophy, strong central government, strong national institutions. Alexander Hamilton, pictured here on the right, he was a Federalist and a founder of the Federalist Party. He did a lot of other things with respect to strengthening the federal government, including arguing very hard for the creation of a national bank. The Anti-Federalists. So an anti-federalist or anti-federalist philosophy, again, it's an adjective used to describe people who believe the national government should actually be limited and that the individual states should have more decision-making power than the federal government. They were often called Jeffersonians because their leader was Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson eventually, kind of in response to the creation of the Federalist Party, gets his anti-federalists together, or actually they chose him. Jefferson was a very reluctant head of state. He was a very reluctant leader, at least, I mean, he certainly was a leader, but in terms of being a formal leader, he was reluctant. So the Anti-Federalists, in a way, sort of chose him to be part of the Democratic Republican Party, which was created by Thomas Jefferson. Again, Jefferson, a reluctant leader, but realized that he had the popularity and had the connections and obviously the intellectual ability, based on his writing, the Declaration of Independence and other documents, to be the leader of the Democratic Republicans, who in fact were the Anti-Federalist Party. So Federalists, with a capital F, were what were called loose constructionists. They believed that under the Constitution, you could add to the power of the federal government. The federal government could do things, create programs, create a national bank, have a strong Navy, have a strong military, as long as what they were doing was not forbidden by the Constitution, okay? So basically they were saying that if it's not specifically outlawed in the Constitution, then it should be legal, as long as it doesn't violate the spirit of what's in the Constitution. So an example, the creation of a federal bank. So their justification for creating a federal bank that could lend money to other countries, that could borrow money from other countries to be able to build big infrastructure projects like roads and bridges, and also invest in their military and in their Navy. They felt that it was okay to do this and perfectly legal because of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution and the Necessary and Proper Clause in the Constitution. Now, in another screencast, I'm going to describe the different components of the Constitution. And those specific parts were used as the justification for saying, yes, the federal government actually can create a federal bank, and it should. Again, Federalists, loose constructionists, unless it's specifically outlawed in the Constitution, and as long as it doesn't violate any of the laws or the principles set out in the Constitution, it should be legal. That's where the loose constructionists were coming from. So the Commerce Clause, which I've included a short version of here, basically in the Constitution says, Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So the Federalists interpreted this to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the states as implied permission to create a US bank. Because if you think about it, commerce with foreign nations, that usually includes lending money to foreign nations or borrowing money from foreign nations. If you have a bank, in order to be able to do that, that's backed by the federal government, that makes this activity much easier. In addition to that, you can lend money to the states as you wish, or possibly borrow money from the state. So having a bank is implied here, according to the Federalists. So this was combined with the necessary and proper clause. This is another portion of the Constitution that says specifically, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So what this means is that Congress can make any laws that are necessary to carry out its responsibilities. It's also known as the elastic clause, because this clause was used to stretch the power of the federal government to do different things, like create a bank, like lots of other things that the federal government is going to do over time. Loose constructionists believe that the Constitution itself was elastic, it was flexible, and that Congress would be able to add to the federal government because the Constitution states that Congress can make all laws which are necessary and proper for executing the foregoing powers, which include, raising an army, coining money, and the like. Anti-Federalists were strict constructionists. They strongly disagreed with the idea that you could interpret the Constitution. They felt that unless it was specifically written in the Constitution, it was illegal. Think of a very strict parent. Strict constructionists believe the Constitution already had all of the powers of the federal government and nothing was implied. So the key part of this is that anti-federalists wanted to keep the federal government as small as possible. Now, this is understandable because a big reason for the American Revolution was the idea that a central power, in this case, or in the previous case, the monarchy of England and the Parliament, was taking away people's liberties or was destroying liberty because their power was too great. The Anti-Federalists felt that a federal government, a central government that was too strong, would lead to tyranny and another revolution and strife. So one thing to think about is to put yourself in this time. Who would you have voted for in this time? Think about the hot button issues of the time, the whole issue of whether or not there should be a federal bank, how powerful a president should be, how powerful Congress should be in terms of being able to declare wars, start and end wars. It's also important to understand where geographically different people were coming from. If you think about especially the Northeast port cities, and also in the South as well, port cities and cities that had a lot of manufacturing dealt a great deal with banking, insurance, and the buying and selling of large numbers of products or large industries. They would actually want to have a federal government because that government could cooperate with business. It could negotiate with other countries on tariffs and taxation and actually be a real benefit for growing the economy. So a lot of Federalists came from regions that were like that. A lot of Anti-Federalists tended to be from more rural parts of the United States and tended to distrust strong central government. Many of them were veterans of the American Revolution. A lot of them were very small landowners. And so this idea of centralized power was something that they were very fearful of. So that's a little bit of information on kind of the demographics of Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And if you'd like more information on the Constitution, check out my other screencast on the Constitution. Thanks.